Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this symposium on the law of cousin marriage, sponsored by the Pharos Foundation and hosted by the Woolf Institute. Pharos is a research and public education institution founded in Oxford last year in an effort to fund and promote research in fields that have been politicised, neglected, or under-resourced for far too long. A subject such as today's, which touches on every great theme of human existence: love, hate, sex, disease, death, violence, corruption, and much else besides, is exactly the type of topic that requires, but hitherto lacked, serious discussion by serious experts. The last time cousin marriage featured prominently in public debate in the UK was during the mid-Victorian era, when no less an authority than Charles Darwin sought to include a question on first cousin marriage in the 1871 census. Parliament, of course, rejected this outright as being, quote, particularly sensitive and unacceptably intrusive. And it's not been brought up in a serious way since. Nevertheless, this past year has seen a resurgence in interest in cousin marriage across the Western world, with no fewer than 4 states, Tennessee, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, announcing or implementing bans on cousin marriage in their jurisdictions. We are equally privileged to be joined remotely by Nazir Afsal, OBE, who's a highly distinguished solicitor, former senior prosecutor at the CBS, and the current Chancellor of the University of Manchester. Nazir's lecture tonight is titled "Revisiting Cousin Marriage, the Case for Thoughtful Legislation in a Changing World."
Let me start, if I will, with a recognition of how controversial this subject is, which I think perhaps people in the room may or may not be aware of. But every time I've spoken on this subject, I then find myself subject to a pile-on of abuse publicly. I think the last article I wrote on the subject was for the Birmingham Mail about 3 years ago. And you're used to getting abuse on social media, but I was surprised to receive abuse on LinkedIn. Which I think is not normally a platform where people have a go at you. But I remember one person saying to me that he was going to marry his first cousin next month and inviting me to try and stop him. And I think I realized then that this was a subject that wasn't going to go away, but one that clearly is one of great controversy. But nonetheless, it hasn't prevented me from speaking up, and I continue to do so. And I want to share some of my thoughts with you this evening. Now, the issue of cousin marriage, and I tend to draw a distinction between first cousin marriage and any other type of cousin marriage, because I think the research is, particularly scientific research, is pretty clear when it comes to first cousin marriage. And that's a much easier argument to make than to talk about other cousin relationships. So I will be focusing on first cousin marriage myself, specifically based on those are the kinds of things that I've had to speak on and deal with. And I should say at the outset, yes, I'm Chancellor of the University of Manchester. Yes, I'm chair of the Church of England Safeguarding Panel. I'm chair of the Lowry Theatre and a board member of the Creative Industries Standards Authority, and I'm not speaking for them at all. So I make it very clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of any organisation in which I have a governance role, so that nobody sends abuse at them. Right. This issue of first cousin marriage is at the intersection, in my view, of not just law, but of culture, science, and ethics. And it's one that, as I've said, sparks a debate and raises questions of tradition, morality, and public health. It's not a new issue. I think, Rebecca, you mentioned Charles Dickens. If I remember rightly, Charles Dickens did marry his first cousin. And of course, every time I talk about this subject, people remind me that Queen Victoria married her first cousin, and therefore that gives them a get out of jail card in respect of their relationships. That's how they respond every time this issue is raised. However, as I said, it's not a new issue. It's existed across cultures, religions, and societies for centuries. And in many places, it's been an accepted, even respected practice. Yet in the modern world, and I try and make the point that things have changed and things have moved on. cousin marriage now remains a subject of considerable debate. Some view it as a cultural norm, others as a dangerous practice that risks the health of future generations. In some places, as you know, it's already legally prohibited. In others, it's allowed with very few restrictions. I want to explore, if I can, the complexities of cousin marriage and make the case, I hope, for what I've called the thoughtful, nuanced approach in a world that is rapidly changing. And I think I say that because when we lived in villages everywhere, and there were 12 people living with us, and that was our experience. Our whole life was around those 12 people. Well, obviously, in those situations, you were limited in whom you could marry, and if you ended up in a first cousin marriage, well, you ended up in a first cousin marriage. But we went from villages to towns. We went from towns to cities, and we went from cities to global. And I think that's why the world has changed. And so I suppose the reason why first cousin marriages seem to be in existence has diminished as the world has become more global. And I make that case, but at the same time, if I share a little bit of my own family background, my family come from the northwest frontier of Pakistan, and they moved to Birmingham before I was born. And when they moved, and a lot of immigrant families do this, they tend to move and live together in very close proximity to other immigrant families. It's a sense of security. It gives people some confidence that things haven't changed dramatically, even though physically they have moved 7,000 miles. So the village mentality, if that's not too strong a word, or stronger words, was retained in some respects within immigrant communities, particularly in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. And there was a preponderance of first cousin, or certainly cousin marriages, but first cousin marriages, because again, the people that you were surrounded by, the people that you knew, were people who you were related to in some way, shape, or form. So again, I could understand, if that's the right phrase, what was happening at that time. But as we moved on over the decades that we've been here now, 6 decades in the case of my family, generations have changed, and the expectations of young people have changed, and they are not as keen on marrying their first cousins or cousins as they previously perhaps had been, or had been pressured into being. And I think that's one significant change that perhaps some communities in this country haven't reflected on with the continuing use of first cousin marriages in certain parts of the country more so than others. And I think that's something that I would like, and I want to, and regularly talk about, but want to talk about when I talk to communities themselves about how they should be addressing this issue, that they shouldn't be living in the past. They should be thinking about the future. Now, I think you all know the main risks here, the genetic risks, the health concerns. There are undoubtedly people more learned than I am in the room, but the most commonly cited reason for legislating against cousin marriage is the potential for increased genetic risks to offspring. And when cousins marry, as you know, they share a high proportion of their genetic material, and this increases the likelihood of particularly recessive genetic disorders manifesting in their children. Now, I say this, I also recognize that the risk is still small. So some data I've seen says that in a a non-cousin marriage, where they aren't related, the risks are perhaps 2 to 3%. In a first cousin marriage, that could be as high as 7%. So it doubles or triples, but it still means that 93% or thereabouts of children born to first cousin marriages are absolutely fine. So I think we need to be clear about the fact there is an increased risk, but also recognize that the risk is not so overwhelming that it requires the kind of urgent action that perhaps some people would call for. The scientific studies show that the children of first cousins have a high risk of birth defects, of congenital diseases, genetic disorders. However, as I said, the risk is still relatively low compared to other factors. Um, Somebody said to me, I don't know if this is true, I'm not a scientist, that maternal age, actually, if you are a woman over, I don't know, say 45, having a child, you have roughly the same risk as first cousins. I'm told that's untrue by some people. I'm told it's true by others. And this is what happens when you have a controversial debate. There's sometimes the data and the science is manipulated and perhaps not as clear as it ought to be. But nonetheless, it's significant enough for health experts to consider is a reason for some regulation. Now, the other issue that's often mentioned in relation to cousin marriage is cultural and social norms. Now, in many societies, cousin marriage is seen as taboo or culturally inappropriate, which can lead to stigma, discrimination, familial estrangement. I'll come on to that more in some detail. Laws banning cousin marriage could be seen as a way of reflecting and upholding the social values of the wider community, especially those where such marriages are as viewed as quote unquote culturally undesirable. So we know that happens. We also know that cousin marriages happen for all sorts of reasons, but some of them because it's about keeping the family together. It's about material reasons, i.e., keeping the property of the family within the family. And if you didn't have them, that it would lead to familial disorder, social tension, those kinds of things. And I think that's another issue that we need to be aware of, although I don't give it a great deal of weight. The third concern that I have, and we all have, I imagine, around first cousin marriages is around child welfare. And I'm not just talking about the health risks that I've just touched on, which are which are pretty serious in themselves. But the fact that we have we know that the welfare of the child is the primary responsibility of the state. We have a responsibility to protect them from harmful consequences, and that includes health complications, but it also includes other risks that they may face. And in this regard, I missed all of Rebecca's lecture, but I wondered if she mentioned forced marriage. And forced marriage was criminalized by the last government about 10 years ago now. And you may or may not recall, I actually led on honor-based abuse and forced marriage for the Crown Prosecution Service since the early 2000s. And in fact, I organized not only the first national conference on the subject, but a subsequently US State Department told me it was the world's first conference on honor-based abuse and forced marriage. And it was important to raise the issue because what we were dealing with was the scale of it, 10,000 or thereabout forced marriages a year, a significant number of homicides. The last data I saw was something like a dozen homicides a year, which are so-called honor-related. And invariably, they relate to familial disruption of some kind, i.e., and in some cases, a child refuses a cousin marriage. And having refused a cousin marriage, the impact is very serious, potentially homicidal. And I think that's something that we perhaps mustn't lose sight of. And I think I need to say this from my own familial background, that sadly in South Asian communities, and by that I mean British Pakistani communities, which I know very well, boys are often seen as a blessing and girls are often seen as a burden. In some cases, in many cases, sadly, there is an urge to marry off your daughters as fast as possible in order for you to have carried out your responsibility in relation to them. And doing so, you will, I know of girls who from infancy have been, in effect, assigned their partner for life. They've been told that you will marry your first cousin when you get to the age previously of 16, now of 18. And there is absolutely nothing they can do about that. And it then ultimately leads, as I said, either to a forced marriage, which, whilst it's criminalized, we have to recognize isn't prosecuted significantly, and for all sorts of reasons. But also, it also leads to families disrupting, children leaving home, running away, all sorts of consequences that flow from the fact that that decision has been made as early as possible. And also, families have told me over the years that there's enormous peer pressure. That when they decide, for example, that their child will not go through a first cousin marriage, having originally previously given some kind of commitment to this, that they will face enormous repercussions in doing so. And I'll give you one example, which is a very extreme example, but one I'm familiar with myself. I did a bit of rule of law work in Pakistan about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was in Islamabad High Court, and there was a murderer brought in, or alleged murderer, for a hearing, and I asked why he was there, and he had murdered somebody from another family, and I explored that, and the reason why he had murdered this person from another family was that 2 generations ago, that family had refused a first cousin marriage. 2 generations ago, the feud had lasted decades, but it was as real as a homicide in 2018. And so one cannot underestimate how powerful the peer pressure is. And even when people don't want to commit to a first cousin marriage, they are forced to do so because of the consequences that may follow if they choose not to. And I think we don't pay enough attention really to the fact that there are lots of people who don't want to have to go down this route, but who are obliged to do so. And this is where perhaps the state could step in, and I'll come on to that in due course. We've talked earlier on about public health, but there's also the reason about the burden on public health considerations. I think there was some research recently, Patrick, you know this better than I, which showed that the National Health Service was in certain parts of the country engaged in certain communities more so than other communities. And in part that was due to first cousin marriages. And therefore, we have a responsibility to protect potential harmful consequences. And that also means the burden on the state, I guess, from dealing with these types of the consequences of such marriages. Now, this is dangerous. And it's dangerous because it shouldn't be a reason to be dangerous. But I don't know if you recall, a few weeks ago, somebody called Stephen Yaxley Lennon, you may be familiar with him by his pseudonym, Tommy Robinson. He's currently at His Majesty's pleasure for the next 18 months. But he's a forceful voice of the far right. He actually talked about first cousin marriage in a number of videos, and he used that analogy or used that example that it was creating, in his view, an excess burden on the health service, and as a result, it should be outlawed. Now, the moment I saw that, it was problematic for a number of reasons, but most problematic because it made it more difficult for me to have a conversation with members of the community. If they are, as I said a moment, wishing to address this issue, and there are, you'll see some data, I think, from Bradford shortly that shows there has been a significant decrease in first cousin marriages in the last year, as there had been in the year before. If there is this level of attention now being played to it by communities, they will be reluctant to talk about it and to educate others if they think it's just a tool or just a hammer which the far right would use to attack their communities. So I think one needs to recognize how dangerous it is when people say something like that. I remember the Times newspaper about a dozen years ago asked me why I keep talking about subjects which give the far right ammunition to attack the communities I'm part of. And I said it simply, that if the communities themselves don't deal with the issue, well, that's the problem, and we need to be able to deal with these issues ourselves so that we don't give ammunition to those who would wish to divide us and separate us in some way, shape or form. So I think that is something that we need to recognize, that simply attacking a community for something is actually the wrong approach, because it simply allows the community, or doesn't allow, but makes the community look inward rather than outward. Other issues, I mentioned earlier on about coercion or forced marriage, but we need to prevent coercion. Coercion takes many forms, and particularly in patriarchal societies, when a child is forced to do what her parent or their parents tell them what they must do. And I think we need to find the means by which we can persuade, if at least, um, parents and those who have responsibility for children to ensure that they protect the most vulnerable in society and don't force them down that route. Now, again, I'm aware of instances where a disabled child is married off to a first cousin on the basis that they'll never find another partner. And so what we need to do is to provide support to families who have disabled children, whereas rather than simply attack them for doing what they've done. You can't. I mean, in terms of, I don't want to go into the religious aspects of this. Theologically, yes, cousin marriage is permissible in Islam, for example, but there are many within Islam, particularly strangely conservative groups, who advocate for restrictions. So it's much more complicated than simply saying it is. And there are many other counter arguments for taking taking no action. And it's about religious freedom, cultural freedom. It should be accepted. It should be practiced. It has deep historical, social significance, and prohibiting it in any way, shape, or form infringes on individual and cultural rights. And strangely, if anything, that's a sort of conservative view, and one that, if it's applied properly, means that you don't do anything in this field. You allow people to do what they want. Whilst I talked about the genetic risks, they are low in absolute terms, and some researchers argue that the evidence is not conclusive enough to justify widespread legal prohibition. But that, again, the jury's out on that one. Personal autonomy is another counter argument, that adults should be free to marry whomever they want, including cousins and first cousins, and they should just be trusted to make informed decisions about their marriages, particularly if they have access to genetic counseling and testing. So all of these arguments are alive, and they're issues that we recognize, and that's why I think it's much more nuanced than simply saying we outlaw it. Forced marriage is very easy for me. I worked with the government, Theresa May's government, 12 years ago, to criminalize it, because it was essential in my view to send out a message. The message was that whilst there are crimes that are committed when you do a forced marriage, that having a specific crime of forced marriage actually sends out a very strong message to society that it's not something that we will in any way tolerate or accept. We did the same thing 40 years ago with female genital mutilation. There are lots of laws available that could be applied, assault, you name it, but we made a law specifically about FGM, which we updated more recently, so that we as a state make it very clear that this is our view, that this is something that's unacceptable in any circumstances. And I go back to what I said earlier on, sadly, the number of prosecutions for forced marriage in the 10 years, I can count on the fingers of one hand. The number of prosecutions for female genital mutilation over 40 years, I can count on one hand. And so just having a law doesn't necessarily make the difference that you would think it does. Prohibition doesn't automatically have that impact, but for all sorts of reasons, because you're reliant, aren't you, upon children giving evidence against their parents, for example, and the likelihood of that happening is small. Parents are quite clever in that's the right word in using other countries. They'll take them abroad. For example, the UAE is a good place to go if you want to gently mutilate your child. So there are all sorts of other things that parents and carers will do if you try and prohibit a behavior, but that's not a reason for not doing it. It goes back to my point that actually sometimes stating that something needs to change is a role for government, a role for the state, because it's saying that it's unacceptable and it will change the discourse. But as I said a moment ago, I'm quite positive about this for pretty much the first time in my life, actually, that we may have turned a corner. and that certainly within South Asian communities and British Pakistani communities in the UK, there is now a conversation that's being had. It was much more difficult for all the reasons I've touched on in decades past, but now they recognize the genetic problems. They recognize that there is a bigger pool from where you can identify a partner for your child, and of course the children themselves. They have access to online dating platforms and the like. They don't have to rely upon mum and dad to help them find a partner. So I think the landscape, the modern world, I go back to the fact that we're not a village anymore, that we are a global community, means that the opportunities or the need, if that's the right word, for cousin marriage, first cousin marriage, is actually reducing, and the communities themselves are now acting upon this. However, I think there is a significant role for more that we can do. As I said, there's an ethical dimension to this debate. Should the government be involved in dictating whom individuals can marry based on familial ties? Is it the state's responsibility to regulate relationships that have been culturally accepted for centuries? These are important questions. They touch on broader issues of personal freedom and autonomy. On one hand, the freedom to marry whom you choose is a fundamental right in many democratic societies. People should be able to form unions based on love and shared values and common goals, regardless of their family background. On the other hand, the state has a responsibility to protect public health and to ensure that individuals are not put under risk due to the lack of information or informed consent. In the case of cousin marriage, it is important, I say, to balance these two concerns, personal freedom and public health. Blanket bans on cousin marriage may be overreaching and perhaps unjust, especially given the risks being slightly overstated, but also, more importantly, I think, the fact that the communities themselves are now heading in the right direction, perhaps not at the pace that you and I would want, but they're certainly moving in the right direction. But a lack of regulation or consideration for the potential genetic risks may be irresponsible if we don't do anything. So when I talked about a thoughtful approach, so what should a thoughtful approach be? So I think we must take a multifaceted approach, one that addresses both the scientific and the cultural realities of the practice, as well as the rights and autonomy of individuals. Any legislation, if there is going to be any legislation, I would be very surprised if there is under the current government, should be grounded in scientific evidence. We need to be clear and have clear and accurate information about the actual risks involved in cousin marriage, and not allow conspiracy theorists to make up data, which sadly is happening quite a lot of. In the light of the scientific evidence, which we all then accept, we should recognize that while genetic risks exist, they're often not as severe as commonly thought. So, in conclusion, really, to my mind, the merits of legislating are significant. So, going back to the point about, is it right for us to send a message out? I certainly think perhaps we can do that, but do we need to legislate? I'm not entirely sure about that, particularly given what I said a moment ago about the fact that the direction of travel amongst the communities themselves is positive. The case for thoughtful legislation is not about banning or condoning it outright, but about creating laws that are nuanced, informed by science, and sensitive to any cultural and personal choices. Thoughtful legislation can ensure that the health of future generations is protected, whilst respecting the autonomy and traditions of communities. In this changing world, I think we should not just talk about prohibition, but talk about empowerment. We did that around forced marriage. We wanted to empower victims to be able to get help so that they weren't victims of forced marriage. And I think the same thing could be done around first cousin marriage. We can empower those who are potentially at risk of first cousin marriage through education, through support, through just understanding of their well-being that ultimately prevents them from going down that route. And as I said, we need to support the communities who, in my mind and in my view, are now moving in the right direction to do so. And that means having conversations like the one we're having today, because I think that's simply, not talking about it is not an option, despite the fact that I know I'll get a lot more abuse as a result. I'll stop there.